poor rancher saved two giant Apache sisters, and their chief came with a shocking decision. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's tale. In the vast, sun-baked lands of the American West, there lived a poor rancher named Daniel. His small, run-down farm was tucked away in the rugged hills of Arizona, miles from any town. Day after day, Daniel worked his cattle, lived in isolation, and seldom saw another soul. His neighbors, few and far between, barely noticed him, and he preferred it that way. A man of few words, Daniel didn't have many friends. His life was a simple one, full of hard work and long, lonely days. But everything changed one fateful afternoon. As Daniel was rounding up cattle on the dusty plains, a commotion caught his attention. He heard the sound of hurried footsteps, followed by the low whinny of a horse. Daniel squinted into the distance, his eyes narrowing in the harsh sunlight. Two figures appeared, stumbling toward him, two women. They were of Native American descent, dressed in the traditional garb of the Apache tribe, but what struck Daniel most was their size. These weren't ordinary women. They were giant, towering over him, their features sharp and proud. One of them limped slightly, her foot dragging as she struggled to keep up with her companion. Their clothes were torn, and both were covered in dirt and blood. Despite their towering presence, the look in their eyes was one of fear and desperation. Daniel's instincts kicked in immediately. He knew the land, and he knew danger when he saw it. Without hesitation, he urged his horse forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his rifle, just in case. But as he got closer, he saw no sign of aggression in their movements, only exhaustion. As they approached, the taller woman, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude, spoke in a language Daniel didn't understand. But the meaning was clear. They needed help. The woman with the limp finally spoke in broken English. "Please help us. We are being chased." Daniel's heart clenched. He didn't ask any questions. He knew what he had to do. Without a word, he urged them onto his horse, leading them to his small, dilapidated barn. He didn't know who was chasing them or why, but something about their vulnerability stirred a deep sense of duty inside him. He couldn't turn them away. As they entered the barn, Daniel quickly made them comfortable, offering them water and food from his meager supplies. The women drank thirstily, their hands trembling. Their names, they told him, were Ayanna and Takota, sisters from the Apache tribe. They were being pursued by a group of hostile men, bounty hunters looking to claim their lives. The night passed in uneasy silence, with Daniel keeping watch, his hand always near his rifle. But as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Daniel heard the sound of hooves. At first, it was faint, but as the sound grew louder, his heart began to race. A group of riders was approaching, and they weren't stopping for a friendly visit. Daniel's mind raced. He knew he had to act fast. He quickly checked the barn for any weapons or means of defense. It was just him, the two women, and the quiet, desolate land around them. He wasn't equipped to take on a group of men, especially not when they outnumbered him. But he wasn't about to let these women die on his watch. Without thinking, he grabbed his rifle, stood tall, and prepared to face whatever came through that barn door. He didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was certain. His life was about to change forever. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the sound of hooves grew louder, signaling the arrival of the riders. Daniel's pulse quickened as he glanced toward the barn door. He had no idea who these men were, but he could tell by their approach that they weren't coming for a friendly visit. His heart raced as he stepped closer to the door, his rifle in hand. Ayanna and Takota stood behind him, their faces pale with fear. Daniel motioned for them to stay back, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had to think fast. The riders were getting closer. Daniel's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. He had no idea what kind of trouble he was in, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let these women be taken from him. The barn was small, its walls made of weathered wood and rusted nails, but it would have to do. Daniel took a deep breath and slowly pushed open the door, just enough to peek out. He could see them now, 5 men on horseback, their faces hardened and cold. They were wearing the unmistakable garb of bounty hunters, and their eyes scanned the area with the practiced look of men who had been in this business for far too long. They weren't looking for cattle or supplies. They were after something much more valuable. Daniel's grip tightened on his rifle as he prepared to confront them. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and plans, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to back down. As the men approached, Daniel stepped out into the open, positioning himself between the barn and the riders. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, slowed his horse as he noticed Daniel standing there. "You seen any Apache women around here?" the man called out in a gruff voice, his tone laced with menace. Daniel stood his ground, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "I haven't seen anyone," he replied, his voice steady despite the growing tension in his chest. The leader's eyes narrowed as he studied Daniel, then shifted to the barn behind him. "You sure about that?" he asked, his hand hovering near the gun at his side. Daniel didn't flinch. "I'm sure," he said, his voice calm but firm. For a moment, there was only silence. The wind rustled the dry grass at Daniel's feet, and the distant sound of birds chirping seemed to echo in the quiet. The leader of the bounty hunters seemed to consider his next move, but then a sudden voice from behind Daniel made him freeze. "He's lying." Takota stepped out from the barn, her face full of defiance. She was tall and strong, her eyes fierce with the determination of a warrior. The leader's eyes flicked to her, and a slow smile spread across his face. Well, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like we found what we were looking for after all." Daniel tensed, but Takota stepped forward, her hand raised in a gesture of peace. "You don't want to do this," she said, her voice calm but full of authority. The leader laughed, the sound harsh and cold. "Oh, I think I do," he said, his smile widening as he gestured to his men. "Get them." Before Daniel could react, the bounty hunters moved forward, their hands reaching for their guns. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped between Takota and the approaching men. He wasn't about to let them take her. He raised his rifle, pointing it at the ground in front of the men, the barrel aimed in a warning. "Stop right there," he said, his voice low and steady. The men hesitated, surprised by his resolve. The leader's eyes flicked to Takota, then back to Daniel. "You think you can stop us?" he sneered. Daniel didn't answer. He simply stood his ground, knowing that he couldn't back down now. Takota moved closer to him, her eyes locked on the leader, her posture still calm, but filled with quiet strength. The tension in the air was palpable, the silence stretching for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the leader spoke again. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice cold and threatening. "This is bigger than you. We've got orders." Daniel didn't flinch. "You don't have orders here," he said, his voice steady. "Not anymore." The leader's expression darkened. He motioned to his men, and they began to advance again. But just as they did, a distant sound reached Daniel's ears, a sound he knew well. The unmistakable sound of horses galloping, a large group of them, heading straight toward the barn. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know who was coming, but he knew one thing. Things were about to get a lot more complicated. The leader of the bounty hunters heard it too, and his expression shifted from one of confidence to uncertainty. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath, glancing nervously at his men. Before he could react, the riders appeared over the horizon, at least a dozen of them, their horses kicking up dust as they rode toward the barn at full speed. The leader's eyes widened in disbelief as they neared. "Who the hell are they?" he growled. Daniel didn't know, but he wasn't about to wait around to find out. He reached for Takota's arm, pulling her behind him as the riders approached, their faces hidden by the dust swirling around them. He didn't know who these new arrivals were, but he could feel the shift in the air. Something was about to change, and it wasn't going to be good for the bounty hunters. The riders were closing in fast, the sound of hooves growing louder as they galloped toward the small barn. Daniel's grip tightened on his rifle, his heart racing in his chest. He didn't know who these new riders were, but one thing was clear. They were not here for a peaceful visit. The leader of the bounty hunters, who had been so confident moments ago, now looked unsure. His eyes flicked between Daniel and the approaching riders, and then back to Takota, who stood next to him with her posture stiff, ready for a fight. Daniel took a step forward, positioning himself between the two women and the approaching riders. He didn't know what was about to happen, but he couldn't just stand by. He had to protect them. The leader of the bounty hunters glanced nervously at his men. "We need to get out of here," he muttered, but the men around him were already shifting uneasily, their hands hovering near their guns. Just then, the riders broke through the dust, revealing their identities. They weren't just any riders. They were Apache warriors, their faces painted with the symbols of their tribe, their eyes filled with a fierce determination. Daniel could feel the tension in the air as they rode toward the group. He had no idea who these warriors were or why they had come, but they were definitely not on the side of the bounty hunters. The leader of the bounty hunters cursed under his breath and stepped forward, his hand reaching for his gun. But before he could draw, one of the Apache warriors spoke. "You will not harm them," he said, his voice low and firm. The leader froze, his hand hovering over his gun, unsure of what to do. The Apache warriors had dismounted quickly, surrounding the bounty hunters, their weapons at the ready. Daniel could see the leader's men beginning to panic, their eyes darting around, calculating their chances. The Apache warrior who had spoken stepped forward, his eyes locking with Daniel's. "This is not your fight," he said to Daniel, his voice calm but commanding. "You have done enough." Daniel stared back at him, his heart still pounding. He didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure if he was being protected or if he was simply in the way. But then the Apache warrior turned his attention back to the bounty hunters. "You are trespassing," he said. "Leave now, or we will make you leave." The leader of the bounty hunters swallowed hard, his face pale. He had been in countless dangerous situations, but he had never felt the weight of a threat like this. He knew that these Apache warriors meant business, and they would not hesitate to act. "We don't want any trouble," the leader said quickly, his voice shaking. "We were just looking for—" "We know what you are looking for," the Apache warrior interrupted. "You are looking to take what does not belong to you." The warrior's words were like a slap to the face. The bounty hunters had no choice but to turn and leave. There was no way they could fight their way out of this. The Apache warriors were too many, too skilled. They knew they would lose if they tried. With a grunt of frustration, the leader gestured for his men to follow him, and they quickly mounted their horses, riding off in the opposite direction, their heads low in defeat. As the sound of their hooves faded into the distance, Daniel let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. He looked over at Takota and Ayanna, who were both staring at the Apache warriors, their expressions unreadable. The tension in the air was thick, but it was clear that the immediate danger had passed. Daniel wasn't sure what to say, but the Apache warrior who had spoken earlier turned to him with a nod. "You have earned our respect," he said. "Your actions were noble." Daniel didn't know how to respond. He had just done what he thought was right. He had helped those in need, and it had led to this unexpected confrontation. He wasn't looking for respect, just a quiet life. But something in the Apache warrior's gaze made him realize that things were changing. The warrior stepped back and gestured toward the rest of his tribe. "We will take care of this land," he said. "You do not need to worry about them coming back." Daniel nodded slowly, not quite understanding what the warrior meant. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. The Apache warrior gave him a small smile, then turned to rejoin his people. "You are safe," he said. "For now." As the Apache warriors began to leave, Takota stepped forward, her eyes still locked on the warrior who had spoken. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity and awe. Daniel shook his head. "I don't know," he said, "but they've certainly made their point." Takota looked over at Ayanna, who nodded in agreement. The three of them stood there, watching as the Apache warriors rode off into the horizon. It was clear that their lives would never be the same again. Days passed after the confrontation with the bounty hunters, and though the immediate danger had passed, Daniel's life had taken a turn he never expected. He spent his days working the land, trying to return to his routine, but every now and then his thoughts wandered to the Apache warriors who had come to his aid. There was something about them, about their leader, that left a lingering question in his mind. Who were they really? Why had they come? Daniel had heard the stories, of course. Every rancher in the area had heard whispers of the Apache tribes, their strength, their resilience, their fierce loyalty to their people. But to have them appear out of nowhere, just when Daniel needed them most, was something he could not ignore. One morning, as he was working in the fields, he saw a familiar figure approaching on horseback. Takota. She was alone this time, her expression serious as she rode toward him. Daniel stood up from the fence he had been mending and wiped the sweat from his brow. "Takota," he called out as she drew near. "What brings you here?" She dismounted gracefully, her eyes scanning the land around them before meeting Daniel's gaze. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low. Daniel frowned. "About what?" Takota hesitated, glancing toward the horizon as if unsure of how to begin. "The leader of the tribe, Takota, wants to meet you," she said finally. "He says we owe you a debt. We need your help again." Daniel's brow furrowed in confusion. "I've already helped you. What more can I do?" Takota's gaze softened, and she stepped closer. "It's not just about us anymore, Daniel. It's about our people. Takota has seen something in you. He believes you can help guide us." Daniel shook his head, still trying to make sense of her words. "I'm just a rancher. I don't know anything about guiding anyone." Takota placed a hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly gentle. "You've already done more than you know. Your actions showed you are not like the others. You've earned our respect, and now we ask for yours." Daniel didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't a man of many words, but he had always believed in doing what was right, even when it wasn't easy. Helping Takota and Ayana had come naturally to him, but now it seemed like his actions were about to lead him into something much larger. "Come with me," Takota urged. "Takota is waiting." Without thinking, Daniel nodded. He mounted his horse and followed Takota as she led him across the plains. They rode in silence, the sun beginning to dip low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. After a few hours, they arrived at a secluded valley, hidden from the outside world by towering cliffs on all sides. At the heart of the valley stood a large fire, surrounded by several warriors who stood watch. Takota guided Daniel toward the fire, where a tall, older man sat waiting. His face was weathered with age, his eyes sharp and calculating. Daniel had no doubt that this was Takota, the leader of the tribe. Takota stood at attention, bowing her head slightly in respect before stepping aside. Takota's gaze turned to Daniel, and for a moment, the two men locked eyes. "You are the rancher who helped my people," Takota said, his voice deep and commanding. "I have been watching you. You possess strength, courage, and a heart that is not easily swayed. You saved two of my daughters. For that, I owe you a debt." Daniel shifted uncomfortably under the weight of Takota's gaze. "I didn't do anything special," he muttered. Takota smiled, a faint glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "You did what others would not. You saved lives. You gave without asking for anything in return. That is why you are here now." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Takota held up a hand. "But we are not here for idle conversation. There is something greater at stake. The land we once called home is in danger. There are those who wish to take it from us, to strip us of everything we have fought for." Daniel's heart clenched at the words. He had heard of the encroaching settlers, the expanding towns, the land being bought and sold with no regard for the people who had lived there for centuries. But he never imagined it would affect the Apache tribe. "What do you need from me?" Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. Takota's expression grew serious. "You have a unique perspective, Daniel. You know this land as well as anyone. We need your help to navigate the challenges that are coming. The settlers, the government, they are all closing in on us. We need someone who understands their ways to help us protect what is ours." Daniel stared at him, his mind racing. This was more than just a simple request. This was a plea for survival. He had no idea what he was getting into, but he knew that refusing wasn't an option. "I'll help you," Daniel said, his voice firm. "But I don't know how much help I can be." Takota nodded, as if he had expected Daniel's answer. "You are already more help than you know," he said. "Now, it is time for us to stand together." The fire crackled between them, the flames dancing in the growing darkness. Daniel felt the weight of the decision he had just made settle in his chest. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was part of something much bigger, something that would require all of his strength, his courage, and his heart. He just hoped he was ready for the challenge. The days that followed Takota's invitation were filled with uncertainty for Daniel. As he rode with the Apache warriors, the weight of the decision he had made settled in, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet understand. Takota, the Apache leader, had asked for his help, and Daniel had agreed. He was no longer just a rancher. He was part of something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The tension between the settlers and the native tribes had been growing for years, but now, it seemed, it was about to reach a boiling point. Daniel's role was to guide the Apache warriors, helping them navigate the encroaching settlers who were slowly taking control of the land. He wasn't sure exactly how he would help, but he knew he couldn't turn back. He spent his days riding alongside Takota and the other warriors, learning the customs of the Apache and the way they fought to protect their land. He had always been a man of the land, understanding its rhythms and how to survive in its harshness, but now he had to use that knowledge in a new way. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Takota called Daniel to join him by the campfire. "We have a plan," Takota said, his voice low and serious. "But we need you to lead us to the land the settlers are trying to take. You know this land better than anyone. Your knowledge is invaluable to us." Daniel nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. He had spent years working the land, but now he would have to use that knowledge to help the Apache protect their home. The following days were filled with preparation. The Apache warriors gathered their weapons, their horses, and their supplies. They moved quickly and silently, as only a tribe of warriors could. Daniel had never seen such discipline before, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. As they approached the settlers' land, Daniel felt a sense of unease settle in his chest. He had spent so much of his life living in isolation, far from the conflicts of the world, and now he was standing on the front lines. The settlers had already begun to build their homes, carving out sections of land that had once belonged to the Apache. Daniel could see the signs of their presence everywhere: fences, plowed fields, and crude structures rising from the earth. Takota surveyed the land, his eyes narrowing as he watched the settlers work. "They think they can take what is ours," he said, his voice tight with anger. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He had seen the settlers move into this area over the years, and he knew what they were capable of. But now, standing with Takota and the warriors, he realized just how deeply this fight went. It wasn't just about land. It was about survival, culture, and identity. As they rode closer to the settlement, Daniel's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of horses approaching from behind. He turned to see a group of settlers, armed and ready. They had clearly been waiting for this confrontation. "You Apache scum better turn around and leave," one of the settlers shouted. "This land is ours now, and we're not afraid to defend it." Daniel felt a surge of anger at the man's words, but he kept his composure. This was not the time for a fight. It was time for strategy. Takota raised his hand, signaling for the warriors to halt. He didn't speak, but the message was clear. The Apache would not be the first to strike. Instead, they would stand their ground and defend what was rightfully theirs. "We don't want conflict," Takota said, his voice calm but firm. "We want what is ours, and we will do what it takes to protect it." The settlers laughed, thinking this was just another threat they could ignore. But as they advanced, they realized they were not facing a group of helpless people. They were facing warriors, and they were not going to back down. Daniel stood with Takota, his rifle resting in his hands, his mind working through their options. This was just the beginning of what would likely be a long and hard-fought battle, but Daniel was ready. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back now. The fight for the land had begun, and Daniel would stand with the Apache, side by side, no matter what it cost him. The days that followed were filled with tension. Daniel and the Apache warriors moved swiftly, taking cover in the dense woods that bordered the settlers' land. The air was thick with the scent of pine and dust, and the distant sounds of hammering and construction from the settlement seemed to mock the quiet determination of the Apache. Every day, Daniel felt the weight of the decision he had made to stand with them, and with each passing hour, it felt less like a choice and more like fate. Takota had been right. This was about survival, not just for the Apache, but for the land itself. The settlers were coming, and they wouldn't stop until they had claimed every inch of territory they could get their hands on. But the Apache were not ready to back down. They had fought for this land for generations, and they would continue to fight, no matter the cost. As the sun dipped low one evening, Daniel found himself sitting around a fire with Takota and the warriors. They were planning their next move. The fire crackled in the silence, casting long shadows on their faces. Takota spoke first, his voice low but filled with authority. "Tomorrow, we will strike. We can no longer wait for them to make the first move." Daniel nodded, understanding the weight of the decision. He had seen firsthand how ruthless the settlers could be, and he knew that if they didn't act now, they would be overrun. The Apache had to show their strength. "What do you need me to do?" Daniel asked. Takota looked at him with quiet respect. "You know this land. You can help us move through it unseen. We will attack at night, and we need to get as close as possible without alerting them." Daniel didn't hesitate. He had spent years in these woods, knew every tree, every rock, every creek. If there was anyone who could lead the Apache through this land undetected, it was him. The night before the attack, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest around him. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that broke the stillness. In the distance, he heard the howl of a wolf, and for a moment, he almost felt at peace. But then his thoughts returned to the task at hand. This was no longer just about survival. It was about protecting something much greater than himself. The next day, under the cover of dusk, the Apache warriors gathered in the woods, ready for the attack. Daniel stood at the front, his rifle in hand, as Takota and the others prepared for their assault. The plan was simple: strike fast, hit hard, and leave before the settlers even knew what had happened. As they moved through the trees, Daniel felt his heart racing. Every step had to be calculated. Every sound had to be masked. They were moving in total silence, the only noise coming from the soft rustling of leaves underfoot. The warriors followed his lead, their eyes focused on the ground ahead of them. When they reached the settlement, Daniel signaled for the group to halt. The settlement was just beyond the tree line, the flickering light of campfires illuminating the figures of settlers moving about their work. Daniel motioned for the warriors to split into smaller groups, each one taking a different route to flank the settlers. Takota's voice was barely a whisper in the night air. "We take them by surprise. No one should survive." Daniel's stomach tightened at the thought, but he knew this was the only way. The settlers had taken too much from the Apache already. This was their last chance to take back what was theirs. They moved in closer, every footstep bringing them closer to the heart of the settlement. Daniel's thoughts were a blur as they drew near. He had never been part of something like this, but the weight of his choice had never felt more real. They reached the edge of the settlement just as the last of the daylight disappeared, leaving only the moon to guide their way. The first strike came swiftly. The Apache warriors surged from the shadows, their arrows flying through the air and striking their targets with deadly precision. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he followed suit, firing his rifle at the settlers who had no idea what was happening until it was too late. The chaos that followed was overwhelming. Screams echoed through the night as the Apache warriors moved with brutal efficiency, taking down the settlers who had dared to invade their land. Daniel's hands shook as he reloaded his rifle, his thoughts racing. This was war. There was no turning back now. As the battle raged on, Daniel found himself face to face with one of the settlers, a man who had been caught off guard by the sudden attack. The man raised his rifle, his eyes wide with fear, but Daniel was faster. In one swift motion, Daniel knocked the rifle from the man's hands and tackled him to the ground. The man struggled, but Daniel held him down, his breathing heavy. "Please," the man gasped, his voice trembling. "We didn't mean to." Daniel didn't let him finish. He had heard enough of their excuses. He had seen enough of their destruction. "You came here to take what isn't yours," Daniel said, his voice low and cold. "Now you will pay the price." The man's eyes widened in terror, but before he could say anything more, Takota appeared from the shadows, his gaze fixed on the man. Without a word, Takota raised his weapon, and the man's fate was sealed. The fight was over almost as quickly as it had begun. The Apache warriors had struck swiftly and decisively, leaving the settlers no chance to retaliate. As the last of the settlers fled into the night, Daniel stood in the clearing, his chest heaving with adrenaline. He looked around at the warriors who stood around him, their faces grim but resolute. They had won, but the cost was still unclear. The battle was over, but the war was just beginning. The dawn after the battle was a quiet one. The air was thick with the scent of smoke from the scattered fires, and the ground was marked by the remnants of the skirmish, distant cries fading as the wind carried them away. Daniel stood at the edge of the battlefield, his rifle still in hand, though his body had fallen into an eerie stillness. The Apache warriors had done what they had come to do. They had protected their land, driven back the settlers who sought to take it. But Daniel couldn't shake the weight of the violence they had just unleashed. This was not just a fight over land. It was a fight for survival, for the right to exist. Takota approached him quietly, his eyes dark with the weight of leadership. The battle had been won, but the tension in the air still hung heavy. "You did well," Takota said softly, his voice rough with exhaustion. Daniel nodded but said nothing. His heart was heavy with thoughts of the men he had killed, the families that had been torn apart. He knew it was necessary, but that didn't make it any easier. "What now?" Daniel finally asked, his voice low and uncertain. Takota looked around at the warriors who were now regrouping, gathering their wounded, preparing to move on. "Now we rebuild. But this war is far from over. The settlers will come again. We will have to be ready." The reality of Takota's words settled into Daniel's chest like a stone. This was not a fight that could be won in a single battle. The Apache had won today, but there would be more skirmishes, more bloodshed. As the days passed, the warriors tended to their wounded and began to bury the dead. Daniel helped where he could, but his mind kept drifting back to the violence they had just experienced. In his heart, he knew it was necessary, but he couldn't help but feel the growing dread of what lay ahead. Takota gathered his warriors one evening, his voice steady and authoritative as he spoke to them. "This land is ours," he said. "We will not let it be taken from us. But we must stand together. The settlers are not the only threat we face. There are others, men who seek to break us, divide us, and turn us against one another. We must remain strong, united. If we do not, we will lose everything." Daniel listened closely, understanding the gravity of Takota's words. The Apache had already lost so much, but there was a deeper threat looming. It wasn't just the settlers, it was the forces that sought to destroy their way of life. The following days were filled with preparations. Daniel and the Apache warriors rode the land, scouting out new territories, making sure that no settlers could sneak in unnoticed. Takota's leadership grew stronger, and the tribe's resolve hardened with each passing day. But as much as Daniel had come to respect Takota and the warriors, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were heading into a storm, one that might prove too great to weather. Then, one evening, as the sun set low over the horizon, a messenger arrived from the nearest town. The man was exhausted, his face pale and grim. "The settlers are gathering," he said breathlessly. "They are bringing more men. There is a new leader among them, one who has vowed to wipe you out. They are coming for your land." Takota's face darkened, but he didn't hesitate. "We will meet them," he said, his voice cold and filled with determination. "But we need more than just warriors. We need the support of the land. We need to ensure we control the waterways, the forests, and the mountains. We cannot afford to be divided." Daniel's mind raced. The settlers were already planning their next move, but this new leader, who were they? What kind of man would rise up to challenge the Apache like this? Daniel didn't know the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a fight for land. It was a fight for the survival of the Apache people. Takota turned to Daniel, his eyes serious. "I need you to help us," he said. "You know this land better than anyone. You will be our guide, our protector." Daniel felt the weight of the responsibility fall on him, and for the first time, he realized that he had truly become part of something greater than himself. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was part of the Apache fight for survival, part of a struggle that would determine the future of their people. The battle ahead would not be easy, but Daniel was ready. He had made his choice, and now there was no turning back. The Apache would stand, and they would fight, no matter the cost. The days that followed were filled with intense preparation. Daniel and Takota had gathered their warriors and allies, preparing for the impending confrontation with the settlers. The weight of the coming battle hung heavy in the air, and the quiet tension of the days leading up to the fight was palpable. Daniel spent most of his time alongside Takota, scouting the land, ensuring their movements remained hidden, and positioning the Apache warriors in strategic locations. Every hour that passed brought them closer to the inevitable clash, and every decision felt more crucial than the last. As the sun began to set one evening, casting long shadows over the land, Daniel found himself at the edge of a hill, gazing down at the settlement. It was a calm scene at first glance, the smoke rising from the chimneys, the settlers working on their fields, the distant chatter of families. But beneath that surface, Daniel knew it was all a facade. The settlers were preparing for a fight, and they would not back down without one. Takota approached, his expression unreadable. He had been quiet the past few days, his mind clearly focused on the strategy ahead. Daniel turned to him, breaking the silence. "They're ready. Are we?" Takota didn't answer immediately. Instead, he scanned the settlement, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. Finally, he spoke. "We've waited long enough. The time to strike is now. We will not let them take what is ours." Daniel nodded, feeling the weight of Takota's words settle into his chest. There was no turning back now. The Apache had fought for their land for generations, and now it was time to defend it. The night of the battle arrived quickly. The warriors gathered in the woods, their faces set with grim determination. Daniel stood at the front, his rifle in hand, his mind sharp and focused. Takota stood beside him, offering a final command. "We move at midnight. Strike fast, strike hard. We do not show mercy." The plan was simple. They would attack under the cover of darkness, using the terrain to their advantage. The Apache knew the land better than anyone, and they would use that knowledge to outmaneuver the settlers. As the moon rose high in the sky, the Apache warriors moved silently through the trees, their footsteps muffled by the thick brush. Daniel led the way, his senses heightened as he guided the group. The tension in the air was thick, every rustle of the leaves a potential threat. But Daniel pushed forward, his heart beating in sync with the warriors behind him. They reached the outskirts of the settlement just as the first hints of dawn began to break over the horizon. The settlers were still unaware of the impending attack, too absorbed in their daily routines. Daniel's breath caught as he saw the dim light flicker through the windows of the settlers' homes. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. Takota's signal came silently, a hand raised in the air. In that instant, the Apache warriors surged forward, moving swiftly and silently into the settlement. The first attack was like a storm, swift and overwhelming. The settlers had no time to react, their defenses torn apart in mere moments. Daniel fought with fierce precision, his rifle trained on the nearest threat. The settlers' attempts to retaliate were futile, outnumbered and outmatched. They stood no chance. As the battle raged on, Daniel could feel the weight of his decisions. Every life lost, every shot fired. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a warrior, part of something much bigger than himself. The fight continued into the morning, the chaos of war drowning out all other sounds. Daniel's eyes never left the battlefield, his focus unyielding. Finally, as the dust began to settle, the settlers began to retreat, their defenses crumbling under the pressure. The Apache warriors, victorious, stood tall amidst the wreckage. Takota walked through the settlement, his eyes scanning the area, ensuring that no one was left behind. When he reached Daniel, he stopped and nodded. "We have won today," he said, his voice calm but full of authority. "But the fight is far from over. This battle was just one step toward ensuring our survival. The settlers will come again, and we must be ready." Daniel nodded, his body exhausted but his resolve stronger than ever. The battle had been fierce, but it was only the beginning of a much larger war. The Apache would stand, and they would fight, no matter the cost. Takota turned to his warriors, his voice rising in a battle cry. "We stand together. We fight for what is ours." The warriors echoed his words, their voices ringing out in unison. The fight for the land was far from over, but for the first time in days, Daniel felt a spark of hope. The Apache had shown their strength, and they would continue to fight. This was their land, and they would not let it be taken from them. The war had only just begun, but Daniel was ready to stand by the Apache, side by side, no matter the cost. The following weeks were filled with a growing sense of unease. The settlers had been pushed back, but Daniel knew the fight was far from over. The Apache warriors, victorious in their battle, had managed to secure the land for now, but it was only a temporary victory. The settlers would regroup, bringing more men, more firepower, and more resources. Daniel could feel the weight of the ongoing war pressing on him. He had helped the Apache warriors defend their land, but now he was fully entrenched in their struggle for survival. Takota had made it clear that they would continue to fight, and Daniel was ready to stand beside them. But the toll of the battles, the bloodshed, and the losses were starting to take their toll on him. He had never imagined himself as a warrior, but here he was, fighting not just for survival, but for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. Takota, as the leader of the Apache tribe, never wavered. He was a man of conviction, his resolve unshakable. But even he seemed burdened by the weight of what lay ahead. They had won a battle, but the war for their land, their people, and their way of life was far from over. One evening, as Daniel and Takota stood by the fire, looking out over the land they had just fought to protect, Takota spoke quietly. "You've become one of us, Daniel," he said, his voice low but filled with respect. "You fought beside us, bled with us, and now, you're a part of this fight. The land is ours, but it is also yours, and we will not let it go without a fight." Daniel felt a weight in his chest, a mixture of pride and responsibility. He had never expected to be a part of something so much bigger than himself, but now he couldn't imagine standing anywhere else. He nodded silently, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The Apache had been fighting for generations, and now, he was fighting alongside them. They were his people, and he was determined to see their fight through, no matter the cost. The days continued to pass, each one filled with the tension of knowing that another battle could break out at any moment. The Apache warriors remained vigilant, preparing for whatever came next. Daniel, too, kept watch, knowing that the settlers would come again, but this time, the Apache would be ready. And when they did return, they would not have the element of surprise. They would be met with the full force of the Apache people, led by Takota and supported by men like Daniel, who had chosen to stand with them. In the months that followed, the battles became more frequent, the conflict growing in intensity. But with each fight, the Apache warriors became stronger, more united. They had found a new sense of purpose, a new resolve in their struggle to protect their land. And Daniel, though he had never sought out this life, had become a key part of that resolve. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a warrior, a protector, and a member of the Apache tribe. But even as the Apaches stood strong, Daniel knew that the true test was yet to come. The settlers would not give up easily, and their numbers were growing. The Apache would have to fight with everything they had. And Daniel was ready. The final battle was coming, and he would be there, fighting beside Takota and the warriors, ready to do whatever it took to protect the land they all called home. As he looked out over the land, Daniel knew that the Apache would not be defeated. They had fought too long, too hard, and they would continue to fight. Until the very end. This was their land, their future, and they would not let anyone take it from them. The war for the land was far from over, but Daniel had found his place among the Apache, and he was prepared to see it through to the end. He had made his choice, and he would fight until the last breath, side by side with the warriors who had become his family. Together, they would protect what was theirs, no matter the cost. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the Apache would never give up. And neither would Daniel.